Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Process Podcast.
Team, welcome back to Process Podcast. I'm going solo today. Haven't done one of these in a while. And actually was recommended by my team, or was suggested, I should say, that I should do a solo one. I don't know if that's because they didn't want to be on the episode, or we had no other ideas, but they made me feel special. And I decided, all right, let's do this. The very first ever Process Podcast episode was actually a solo episode. I thoroughly enjoyed it. And as I sat down thinking, what should we talk about on this podcast this week? I thought about something that we just did as a team just a few days ago, which was together create the next training cycle for our Live, Perform, and Compete and Elite training cycles, which are our 4 group programs. And programming is something that I think most listeners will know, something I love doing, something I'm very passionate about, something which I think I'm actually quite good at as well, something which I get very kind of flow statey when I do. So I can kind of sit down in front of a spreadsheet or in front of a program, however I'm writing that program, and kind of just get lost in it for hours. It's something that when I first got into coaching, I geeked out a lot and had kind of a lot of obsession over learning how to do it and how to understand it. You know, I've talked in previous episodes about some of the amazing mentors that I've worked with. And I guess, this is just a product of writing training programs, well, for 14 years as a professional coach. But, even when I think back to, secondary school days as a 16-year-old, writing my first training programs, then going to university and writing training programs for myself and training programs for my friends and some of my friends' sports teams. And so I guess I've been doing writing programs or designing programs for a really long time. And it's just something I just love doing. So I thought I'd actually kick off this episode by talking about kind of my journey with writing group programs since starting Coastal Fitness and since we started essentially doing group classes and kind of how that process has evolved over the years. And I hope that people listening, what they'll take away from this episode is hopefully empathize or understand that, you got to start somewhere. And that's, all of us have to go through some form of journey with regards to kind of acquiring skill and talent in anything. So if you're at a stage with programming where you're writing a program for yourself or you're writing a program for your gyms and you find it to be an arduous or really challenging task, there is hope. You will improve with practice. But yet, I guess also to provide a framework. So if you are writing programs or, you're someone who follows training programs and you just have a bit more interest in understanding how it all works and how do these programs get written and how does something go from an idea in someone's head to being on the paper in front of you or the screen in front of you, how does that whole process look like? So that's the intention for today's podcast. So when I think about when we first started running group classes here at Coastal, and let's call them CrossFit classes, although we've never really attached ourselves to the name CrossFit, we do love mixed modal fitness. So what I mean by mixed modal fitness is that our group training sessions are a combination of resistance training, energy system training, there's elements of gymnastics, there's elements of weightlifting, Olympic lifting, all forms of bodybuilding. Yeah, kind of all those things kind of mix mash together in some form of structured progressive manner, hopefully. That's always been something we've done. So, I did the CrossFit Level 1. I think the first ever CrossFit Level 1 in Asia when it first came to Singapore. I've talked about my history in strength and conditioning a lot, so I won't bore you with the details. But essentially coming from a very structured background, learning all about progressive overload and taught mainly under the Charles Poliquin banner, and then kind of discovering this or finding out or learning about this constantly varied thing was kind of hectic for me. Just was really unsure as to how it all worked. I really questioned myself with regards to what I'd learned previously about, like structure and periodization and all that good stuff that you learn in strength and conditioning textbooks and from coaches being in the game for a long time, to suddenly doing a CrossFit Level 1 and hearing about the importance of constant variance. So yeah, a lot of second guessing, but I guess I really adopted the constant variance model when we first started group training. So whilst I never let go of things like structural balance training, periodization, progressive overload, some of those facets with our strength training, I did definitely implement a lot more randomized training. And so kind of when we first started as an organization writing group programs, we adopted the very old school CrossFit approach. It was like have a whiteboard in the gym, get a group of coaches together and scribble down a session on a whiteboard, do it yourselves, have a bit of fun. And then that would somehow make its way probably to the group program that you're prescribing to your clients. Obviously, whilst that's fun, whilst there's teamwork involved, and yes, it does tick the box of being constantly varied, the problems that we ran into was that we weren't managing people's recovery very well. So we sometimes, programming far too many hard days consecutively, so people were getting injured, people were getting burnt out. Movement patterns, movement selections weren't intelligently thought out, so people were doing the same movement patterns in consecutive days and then getting kind of overuse injuries. We'd realized that we weren't creating a balanced program. When you're not taking, zooming back and having a look at everything you're writing down, you tend to bias certain time domains. You tend to bias certain strength qualities. You may tend to bias certain movement patterns. And so we started to realize that whilst it was fun, but over time, people just weren't progressing, and actually people were getting very burnt out, very broken, very injured. So that didn't really work. Obviously, throughout this process, at some point in time, we evolved very early on to have multiple groups. So rather than just having one group program and, prescribing one workout and scaling it up and down for the people who followed it, we, soon broke into 2 programs with different focuses. And then that kind of evolved eventually as our membership grew into 3 programs. But I remember when we started to evolve into multiple programs, obviously that's now a lot more programming that you have to do. So one of the things we did was I would write one training program, one of my other coaches would write another training program, and one of my other coaches would write another program. So what we started to have was actually a little bit more clarity and more well thought out training programs for each training group, but they just didn't sync together. So you can imagine if you're a coach and you're trying to run a class of 20 people, and within those 20 people, you got 3 different training groups all happening at the same time, and you got 3 completely different programs, how much of a nightmare that was. And it was a nightmare, to be honest. On paper, it seemed like a really good, well thought out program, but in terms of execution and delivering it, terrible. So what we ended up doing was just trying to manage chaos and try to get everyone through their workouts. And we actually had 0 time left to actually coach and help people. So we realized whilst that managed the workload a bit better, it allowed us to put a bit more thought into each individual program. It just didn't sync together. The goals in our group classes, like these 3 different programs should be flowing together. They should be feeling somewhat like they're moving as one, despite there being individual differences between the 3 groups. So we scrapped that idea pretty quickly. Then essentially I made the call one day that, there just needs to be one person taking control of all the training groups. And so, it was decided as a group that person would be myself. And so now what you do have, which is great, you've got one person looking after all the programs. So in terms of syncing the sessions up and making sure they all flow together, that was a lot better now, because you just had to basically start with one program and then kind of fit the other 2 kind of around it. But it did also mean a lot more workload, because essentially now I was going from writing one session or one program to suddenly writing 3 programs. So that was a challenge in itself. So I started to realize, at the time as well, I was doing lots of other coaching hours, trying to run a business, trying to build a team, trying to build a future for Coastal. Quality started to slip. So there'd be little mistakes, there'd be maybe oversights, not taking enough of a macro view as to what's the bigger picture of what we're trying to achieve with the programs, getting a little bit stuck in like the day-to-day programming. That kind of evolved. And obviously, everything I'm talking about here is kind of an evolution over like a 10-year period of running group classes here at Coastal. Then, as I started to get more experience and started to think about and critique the programming more and see what was working, see what wasn't working. And this is, very much how we write training programs now, is really starting with the macro. When we talk about the macro, typically, especially within like a CrossFit type program, where generally you're peaking people for a goal or a time in the year. For most people in CrossFit, that's a CrossFit Open. Obviously, if you're more of an elite competitor, that might be things like quarterfinals or semifinals or CrossFit Games. But generally speaking, like the macro cycle, it runs on a 1-year basis. So you kind of got a 1-year window, do all this cool training, create some adaptations, and then at the end of that year, review it, and then reset the next year. And essentially, it just kind of repeats and repeats and repeats in 1 year cycles. So that's what we call a macro cycle. And when we talk about something called a mesocycle, we're now looking at like smaller chunks of time within that year, where there may be like a general focus. All the training cycles that are happening within that mesocycle are all kind of leading towards the same thing. So if I kind of put this back into context as to what we've just completed, it's June 22nd right now. And, we're 11 weeks, about 12 weeks since the CrossFit quarterfinals finished. So what we've had is a 12-week mesocycle, which we called an accumulation cycle. We're talking about accumulation. We're really talking about lower intensity work, focusing a little bit more on structural balance, probably more of an emphasis on strength endurance or hypertrophy, less of a focus on absolute strength. Generally speaking, the training is a little less intense. We're spending a little bit more time doing technique work, refining imbalances and skills that need to be brought up from the last year. And that's what we generally refer to as accumulation work in a CrossFit program. Basically, what we're saying is that the training looks a lot less like the sport. So if the sport is testing 2159 thrusters and pull-ups, then we're not doing all that much of 2159 thrusters and pull-ups in an accumulation phase. So that's what we refer to as a mesocycle, kind of like within the big 1 year overall picture, kind of like 12 to 16 to 24 week blocks where the general focus will be the same. So then you take that mesocycle and you can narrow that down even further now, what we call a microcycle. So a microcycle is within that mesocycle, so that 12, 24, 36 weeks that we just talked about, you'll have very specific training cycles. So again, putting this back into context into what we've just done is since the CrossFit quarterfinals, it's been about 12 weeks. And that 12 weeks we divided into 2 6-week cycles. So basically the mesocycle was 12 weeks, the microcycles are 6 weeks. And each of those 6 weeks had very specific focuses that we were trying to work on. So we picked a few things that we wanted to say, okay, we're going to get good at these 3 or 4 things, and everything else out of those 3 or 4 things are going to go into maintenance mode. And then we'll evolve that for the next 6 weeks, and then we'll evolve, so on and so forth. So basically what the training process, the program design process looks like right now, it starts by looking at the start of the year, or you can say at the end of the previous year, sitting down and looking at that overall picture. What do we want this 1 year to look like? Obviously, when you're doing that, when you're asking yourself that question, there has to be a lot of review from the previous year as well. Like, what did we do last year that worked really, really well? And what do we want to do next year to improve on that? Maybe there were no lessons, maybe there were lots of lessons. And we certainly had quite a lot of lessons from last year. So essentially, you basically map out, that entire year. And the first thing you write down is, okay, well, when do I need my athletes or my client to be at their physical best? So for us, we know generally speaking, that's around February, March time when the CrossFit Open arrives. So you write that down. You basically think about, you've got this calendar, either you can visualize this big calendar on a wall in front of you, or I use Google Sheets where I basically map down each week within the year. And then within each week, there's a Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, a chance for you to write things in there. And essentially you start by writing down that end date, that goal. And then essentially all you do, you work backwards from there. Okay, so if that goal is in 12 months time, what do I need to do to get people really ready for the CrossFit Open? Well, I know generally speaking, I want people to be doing CrossFit Open style prep 2 to 3 months before the CrossFit Open. Okay, so then I just go into my calendar 2 to 3 months back, and I make a little note 2 to 3 months before the CrossFit Open, start CrossFit Open competition prep phase. Okay, well, what do we want to do before we go into a competition prep phase? We can't just do really easy training and then suddenly ramp people into a competition prep phase because they're not going to be ready to handle the changes in contractions, volume, and intensity. So in that pre-competition phase, okay, maybe we put in what we call an intensification phase. So, we're basically, intensification is kind of bridging the gap between accumulation work, which I already talked about, and that hard competition prep work where they're actually kind of doing variations of the CrossFit Open in a probably less intense, lower volume state. So, okay, we're going to put an intensification phase in here somewhere. So you make a little rough note in your calendar. Okay, we're going to do some intensification work for probably 8 to 12 weeks. Okay, so what comes before that? How do I prepare someone for an intensification phase? Okay, well then I need to do some accumulation work. And essentially that's how the whole process works. So before you do anything when it comes to programming, you've got to sit down and look at that entire year. Now, if you're an Olympian or you're working with an Olympian, that macro cycle is 4 years. You've basically got a 4-year window to try and create some rough ideas as to how you want to break up that 4-year period to ensure that at the end of the 4 years, this person is going to be at their physical and mental best. It's a really fun process, but as you can imagine, like, it rarely goes to plan. But it's important that you have that plan there so you can just reference it, because once you've done that plan and then you start sitting down and going into designing each microcycle, in 6 months' time, when it comes to write, the next cycle, you're going to forget what the hell is the actual goal for this person, especially if you're a coach writing multiple programs for different people. It's really important that you've got that reference chart there that you can go back to, that thing you wrote 6 months ago, and refer back to that. Yes, okay, I remember what I'm doing. I remember what the goal is. I remember roughly what I should be doing in this cycle. And then, of course, in the moment, you can decide, okay, I think we need to change this a little bit. That last cycle didn't go as planned. We need to make some adjustments here. Maybe we've got to stretch out this cycle a bit longer. Maybe we can shorten this cycle a little bit. There's going to be flexibility as you go through it. But most importantly, the point I'm trying to make here is you've got to start with that macro cycle. Of course, and then you go backwards. You just go into then each mesocycle and you write all that stuff down, and what do we want to focus on? What's the priorities? Link it with pre-comp, intensification, accumulation, all that kind of stuff, so on and so forth. So the point I'm trying to make here is that that's really how we write our programs. But for a long time, I was doing that whole process by myself. And so, essentially I would sit down at the end of the year. I would sit down each month. I'd sit down at the start of each cycle. I'd obviously sit down every day and write out, or I should say every week, and write out what that week of training looks like. Now, the really cool thing that we have here, which has now evolved my process even further, is that pretty much all of the coaches do the Live, Perform, Compete, and Elite program in some way, shape, or form. So what I have the advantage of having is, a bunch of really intelligent coaches who understand strength and conditioning, who are also athletes in their own right, who are actually doing the program. And so I realized one day, I need to be using these people. These people have loads of important data that I could be using to allow me to write even better programs. And so what we do now, we've been doing this now for probably the last 4 to 5 months. It started as professional development sessions where essentially I would take the team through my process of how I'd write training programs. We did this every week. And so what the team did over, a 1 to 2 year period was get really good at also understanding how to write group programs. This is kind of one of the things that we focus on a lot of program with our professional development here at Coastal. But now we actually write the training cycles together. So this is what we did just the other day, which kind of was kind of my inspo behind this podcast, was, sat in front of a whiteboard, had the whole team sprawled across the room and said, right, I'll guide us through this whole process, but I would like feedback from everyone. And so essentially we went through the whole process. Well, what is the focus of this training cycle? So we all had to go look at the calendar we set out at the start of the year. Okay, the focus is this. What have we done in the last 2 training cycles? Okay, we've done this, we've done this. Okay, what are some of the things we want to focus on this cycle? And basically together over a 1 hour period, we just basically created a pretty basic framework of what the priorities will be for each training group, what the movements that we're going to be moving into maintenance mode will look like for each training group, and then basically having on the whiteboard Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, and starting to slot in for each training cycle what we want to be doing on each day and why. And so now I think we have a really great system where we have a bunch of smart individuals all contributing to writing this program. And of course, once that framework is done, that's all the hard bit. The easy bit then is just me sitting down and kind of filling in things like reps and sets and exercise selection, things I feel very, very comfortable with. But knowing that I have that amazing framework makes that process super easy. So, just for those listening, wanted to kind of share the history on how we've gotten to this point, I think, of writing really good training cycles and training programs. All the trials and tribulations and the errors that we used to make. When I first started writing group programs, it was intimidating. There was a lot of anxiety around second guessing myself. Not sure if this is good. How else can I do it? And obviously you end up, when you're second guessing yourself all the time, you end up going back and changing things and not really trusting the process because you never really trusted the process in the first place. Whereas now, I can take real confidence in a program that I write, knowing that, okay, this is good. We need to now trust this and go. And I think at the end of the day, something I always say is that there is no right or wrong when it comes to writing a training program. There are millions of different ways to write a training program and achieve essentially the same result. The most important thing that you need to be able to ask yourself as someone who's writing programs, whether it's for yourself or for other people, is why am I doing this? Why did I make this choice? Why did I make this decision to do this? And as long as you can always provide a logical explanation for why something has been programmed, then you're good. and go with it. If you're someone who's writing programs for yourself, find someone else to ask you those questions. Ask your clients. And if your clients do ask questions, hey coach, why is this being written here? Make sure that you are not getting offended. Make sure you're checking your ego at the door and you're actually responding to them with a logical answer. And if they don't understand your answer or the answer doesn't make sense, maybe you need to go back to the drawing board and actually revisit, maybe potentially putting something else in there. Okay, so I want to kind of talk to you about what we've just done to kind of give you a bit of a working example of how this actually all works. So what we've just done now, as I said, we're about to finish a 12-week accumulation cycle for the Live, Perform, Compete program. So what we said, I think a question you may be asking is like, well, how do you choose 12 weeks? How do you choose 6 weeks? How do you choose 8 weeks? Again, there's just no right or wrong. But what we did when we looked at our macro calendar is we kind of worked back from the CrossFit Open. One of the biggest things we learned last year in terms of how we wrote the programs, and I take ownership for a lot of this because I was doing a lot of this by myself, was that we spent a little bit too long doing accumulation work last year, which means that we didn't do enough of the crazy CrossFit that CrossFit people who want to compete in the sport need to do. What I mean by that is, like, if you want to be good at 2159 thrusters and pull-ups, at some point you need to be doing iterations or versions of 2159 thrusters and pull-ups. What you can't be doing is just isolating front squats, isolating push presses, and doing strict pull-ups all year in the hope that one day when you do 2159 thrusters and pull-ups, it's all going to magically come together and you're going to hit a new PR or a world record in that workout. It's just not how it works. Remember this specificity. Specificity means that you need to specifically do the thing that you want to get better at. Broken down variations of it are fantastic to build foundations to allow you to do the thing better, but at some point in time, you need to transition to that. So last year we realized we just did a little bit too much of that work and didn't do enough of the crazy stuff throughout the year. What we ended up doing was spending a big kind of 4 to 5 months of accumulation work. And then as the season rolled in, we transitioned straight into harder work. And that was just a big step up for people to handle. So people got a little bit more burnt out than I wanted them to. Thankfully, like, very minimal injuries, which is very happy. Even that's something that's always going to be one of our objectives here. But I just don't think I set people up for success as well as I could have done. So what we said this year was that, okay, we're going to start the season with a 12-week accumulation phase, which is going to be all the things we talked about. And then after a 12-week accumulation phase, we're going to throw in kind of a 6 to 8 week intensification phase, kind of in the middle of the year. And what this is going to do is it give people a chance to do a little bit more of the craziness of CrossFit. Not for too long. After this kind of 6 to 8 week phase, we'll go back into some more accumulation work and continue to rebuild those foundations. But it just ensures that people don't completely lose touch with elements of the sport. So when I talk about elements of sport, I'm talking about things like barbell cycling. I'm talking about things like kipping gymnastics. I'm talking about not isolating things so much, putting them in couplets and triplets, not being so regimented with the aerobic progressions and doing a little bit more variety. That might mean doing just less cyclical monostructural work and doing more combinations of gymnastics, weightlifting, and monostructural work. That's kind of what I mean. And so what we decided to do at the start of the year was actually tie together this intensification phase with a competition. So every year we do the process program in Summer Throwdown. This year it's going to be bigger and better than ever before. Essentially what it is an online comp. We open up to the entire world. All of our affiliates run it over a 3-week period. So it's super fun. It's super exciting. And essentially what we're going to do this year is we scheduled that competition to be kind of middle of summer. And we're going to use this 8-week intensification phase to prepare people for that comp. So it's fun. It gives people a chance to get some like competition prep in the middle of the year. Essentially a very similar process to what we do when the CrossFit Open eventually rolls around. So that's what we're about to do. We finished our 12 weeks of accumulation work and we're about to go into a 6 to 8 week intensification phase where we're going to prepare all of our subscribers, all of our athletes and our affiliates for the 2023 Process Summer Throwdown. Exciting times. So what do we have to do now? Well, how do we prepare people for the 2023 Process Throwdown? What does that look like? Well, we know what the last 12 weeks have looked like. We know the last 12 weeks has been, sub-maximal, easier training, lots of bodybuilding, not a whole bunch of CrossFit, to be honest. So the first question we have to ask ourselves is, well, what are the tests at the Process Throwdown going to look like? Because essentially now that's what we need to prepare our people for in the next 12 weeks. So that's what we decided as a team. Well, what does the process program the process programming summer throwdown workout's going to look like, well, they're going to look very much like the CrossFit Open. This is going to be an online competition, so we need to be picking movements and workouts which people can actually film and upload, and us as a reviewing team can actually watch these workouts and verify them. So what does that immediately cancel out? Probably not going to be swimming, probably not going to be doing outdoor running. The movements we're going to be doing are probably going to be on something like a rower, because everyone's got a rower. Maybe not everyone has an assault bike, so let's not include assault bikes in there. There might be shuttle running. That might be something we can include, but we're not going to be sitting on machines or doing stuff outdoors. In terms of equipment, we're definitely going to be utilizing bodyweight movements. We've got pull-up bars. We can do handstand push-ups. We can use barbells, and we can use dumbbells. Maybe we can use kettlebells. So as soon as we have that conversation to decide what we want to include, generally speaking, in the tests of the process summer throwdown, we can now use those movements and those time domains to now inform what the training for the next 6 to 8 weeks is going to look like. So what that means, in summary, is that all those things that I said are not going to be included in the throwdown, we're probably not going to be doing much training on those things for the next 6 to 8 weeks, because that means we're missing out on an opportunity to do another movement or another variation of working out that will actually be specifically geared towards this goal that we've set. So what did that lead us to deciding? Well, we also had to factor in what we have just completed. So the next thing we did was we wrote on the whiteboard, over the last 12 weeks, what were some of the testing priorities that we laid out for our groups. So what we often do when we write a new training cycle, and we've done 2 6-week training cycles, is we say, okay, based upon the general focus of this block, of this cycle, what are some things that maybe we could test at the end of the cycle? And the reason it's really nice to write things that you're going to test is because it gives you clarity and direction with how you write that training program. Now, it doesn't mean that you should just be picking any random test and just sticking it in there. Going back to the focus of the cycle, well, we've got accumulation work, which means that generally if we're going to be doing strength testing in an accumulation cycle, it probably needs to be higher rep testing. Accumulation work, generally speaking, doesn't mean we're going to be doing things like 1 rep maxes. In terms of Olympic lifting, we're probably not going to be doing 1 RMs. We may be doing complexes or higher volume variations. So we've done things like a power clean 3 rep max or a power snatch 2 rep max. In terms of resistance training, maybe this is a great chance to do some like remedial testing. So things like dumbbell overhead press 6 rep max is what we did in one of the cycles. A weighted pull-up 4 rep max. A V-bar dip 6 rep max. A deadlift 5 rep max. If you look at the tests that we've actually implemented over the last 12 weeks, they're all on the higher end of repetitions when you kind of look at the strength continuum. Now, if we were in an intensification phase, let's say we're getting a little bit closer to something like the CrossFit Open, those tests might look a little bit different. That might be something like squat snatch 1 rep max. It might be a repeat workout from the CrossFit Open. It might be 100 chest to bars for time. It might be 50 strict handstand push-ups for time. It might be a 200-foot handstand walk for time. So you can see that the tests are getting a lot more specific relative to what the test might be that we're eventually preparing for. So what we did, we wrote down this of those 12 weeks, we wrote down all the tests that we did. And obviously, the first 6 weeks, those tests led nicely into the next 6 weeks. So kind of we saw the rep schemes and the movements of the tests change a little bit. And so now what we want to do is make sure that the next set of tests that we're programming are nice, natural continuations on from the last 2 cycles. So we basically decided, and this is something we always do when we pick tests for a training cycle, is sometimes you want to test everything. And this is the mistake that I think CrossFit gyms often make, which is they pick too many priorities and they try and get good at all those things. And what you end up having is it's not enough time in the week, so you don't give any one of those things enough exposure to actually adapt and evolve. So what we have to do is we have to accept, in a sport like CrossFit, when there's 1,000 things we're trying to get good at, rather than trying to get good at all 1,000 things, pick 2 to 3, maybe 4 at max, and really focus on getting good or making improvements in those 3 to 4 things. Everything else outside of that kind of goes into maintenance mode. Maybe there are some things that actually you don't even touch, or maybe you drip into the program once every few weeks to kind of make sure that people don't forget how to do it. But generally speaking, that's the approach that we take when we write our training cycles. Anywhere between 2 to 4, really focus adaptations, do as much as we can, get as good as we can at those things. And then the next cycle, those things, either we decide, maybe we actually didn't get as good as we wanted to. We need to spend a bit more time doing these. So maybe those things stay in the next training cycle, or like we have done for the last 12 weeks, we change up those testing priorities completely to make sure that over a 12-month period, We're testing a really broad range of different things. We're keeping our athletes balanced. We're making sure we're not creating overload patterns with the things we test. And so at the end of the year, like, these people should be strong and well conditioned in all facets of fitness, because essentially that's what we're trying to do with CrossFit. So we wrote out what those testing focuses are. Just for an example, we decided for our perform and compete athletes, their very first 6 weeks of this training year, they did some weighted pull-ups. They built to a 4-rep max and 2-rep max for ladies. The last training cycle, we kind of put our upper body pulling work into kind of maintenance mode. So we kind of put some legless rope climbs in there, some strict pull-ups, some horizontal pulling. We've decided now, okay, I think it's important at this point in the year, it's still early on in the season, we should probably do another phase of weighted pull-ups. So what we would call strength endurance or absolute strength with our vertical pulling. Because we know that as the season rolls on, we get closer to CrossFit Open, those weighted pull-ups are going to be replaced by things like chest to bars, bar muscle-ups, and ring muscle-ups. So if we can focus a bit more now on developing absolute strength and strength endurance, that's going to set us up in really good stead to be doing more dynamic contractions later. We're going to have stronger, more resilient joints that's going to be able to handle those more dynamic contractions. One of the other things we picked was a squat clean 2-rep max. Now, why a squat clean, you ask? Well, if we look back at what we did in the last 2 cycles, the very first 6 weeks, we did a back squat 5-rep max. And then in the next 6-week cycle, we did some power cleans, but we also built to a front squat 5-rep max with a pause. So naturally now, over the last 12 weeks, we haven't really been doing any squat cleans. We've been doing lots of squatting strength work. We've been doing lots of power cleans, so people have been working on their Olympic lifting technique with the clean, but now it's time to put all those things together. Now I know I can say with confidence that we're probably going to see some PRs, some big lifts go up when we test a squat clean in 6 to 8 weeks time, because people have just done 12 weeks of isolated, lots of time and attention, lots of positional squatting. Awesome. In the first cycle, we did a back squat 5-rep max, and in the next cycle that we're just about to finish, we didn't do any back squatting at all. We actually changed the squatting focus to front squats. So what we're going to do in this next cycle, we're actually going to introduce back squats back into the program, but rather than doing a 5-rep max, which we did in the first 6 weeks, we're going to kind of continue down the strength continuum and do a back squat 3-rep max. One of the last testing priority we decided to pick for Perform Compete is some strict handstand push-ups. We're going to do a capacity test, and we actually do this test every year. It's kind of one of our staples. It's a 5-minute AMRAP of strict handstand push-ups. That's something we're going to test at the end of the cycle, and so we're going to prepare people for that test. Why are we doing strict handstand push-ups? Why are we doing a 5-minute AMRAP? Well, if we look at the very first 6 weeks, we prepared people for a dual dumbbell overhead press 6-rep max. So that's what we call kind of overhead pressing strength endurance. Also using dumbbells was great because it allowed people to get some kind of single arm work in there and kind of address some unilateral imbalances or differences. And then when we took that in the next cycle, as we evolved and we moved away from dumbbell overhead pressing and we went to a barbell strict press. So they went from essentially single arm movement to a dual arm overhead press, and the rep scheme dropped, so it got a little bit more intense. So we've essentially done 12 weeks of overhead pressing absolute strength and strength endurance work. Over that time, we've done very, very little strict handstand push-ups. So now I'm confident if we go into a strict handstand push-up cycle, people are going to be prepped. Their joints are going to be ready to rock and roll. They've done lots of absolute strength work. Now we can go into kind of more strength endurance or muscle endurance work, depending on how good you are at strict handstand push-ups, and be able to execute those things safely. And we're probably going to see some really good results at the end of this cycle. So there you have it, folks. That's basically the process that we have been through, and that's how we write our training cycles. Obviously, the next big piece here, which is obviously hard to kind of explain on a podcast, but it's like, okay, you've got these testing priorities. Now, how do we actually design the testing week? So now we have to basically write down, okay, I like to kind of write it into different categories. For simplicity's sake, we write the general focus for the cycle. So what we know for this general focus for this next 8 weeks, competition prep, intensification, less isolated work, heavier loads of resistance training, more CrossFitty is something we could probably say. And then you can kind of create some categories like, okay, within weightlifting, what are the things we want to make sure we're addressing in this cycle? So some of the things we wrote was, okay, we want to make sure we're getting some varied snatch work in there, because the last 12 weeks we've done very specific snatch work. We obviously got to do our squat clean, which we talked about. We're going to progress people from static overhead pressing. So we did the dumbbell overhead pressing. We did strict pressing. Now we're going to progress people to push pressing and split jerking. And we're going to do some kind of fatigue-based overhead squatting. We've obviously got our back squats and our deadlifts, which we just built to a 5-rep max last cycle. We're going to move into more of like a touch and go setting, which is a little bit more sport specific. And then, of course, we can do the same thing. But this time we're going to do it within gymnastics. Okay, within gymnastics, which is obviously a very important component of CrossFit, what are the things we want to focus on in this next cycle? So some of the things we wrote was, of course, the strict handstand push-up 5-minute AMRAP. We're going to do a ring pull-up because we're going to build a weighted test. We're going to also reintroduce some more dynamic reps. So we're going to do things like isolated chest to bars, pull-ups, isolated muscle-ups in the program now, because we haven't been really doing any of that in the last 12 weeks. We've just been building really, really strong foundations. Again, I'm confident now going into a chest to bar phase that people having done all that strict work are now going to have much more resilient shoulders. They're going to have stronger structures. They're going to have more well-developed lats and rear delts and biceps to be able to handle those more dynamic contractions without the fear of getting injured or broken. And then probably the last category would be like, okay, conditioning. What do we want to focus on with our conditioning? Well, the last 12 weeks, we've been doing pretty much a Saturday tester, which is a little bit varied, a little bit crazy, a little bit different each week. But on the Tuesdays, we've been doing monostructural aerobic work. So basically sitting on rowers, doing some running, doing some skipping, doing some assault biking, doing some bike erging, doing lots of that stuff. Basically just building that aerobic base for the last 12 weeks. But now we're actually going to start to move towards more mixed modal work. So we're going to combine those monostructural elements with things like bodyweight exercises, dumbbells, medicine balls, burpee box jump overs, some single leg work, but we're not going to be doing any like really hard, heavy metcons just yet. Maybe we'll save that for when the process open throwdown, the process programming summer throwdown rolls around. So there you have it, folks. I think that was a pretty elaborate way to kind of break down how we go about programming. This was perhaps a bit more of a geeky episode. I love this shit. And hopefully there's some geeks out there who also love this shit. If this has sparked a few ideas in you, you have questions, you'd love to know more about how we arrive at certain conclusions or just general questions around programming, please feel free to shoot me a message. I really try my absolute best to respond to everyone on things like Instagram. I say that like I get a lot of messages. I really don't get very many messages. So if I don't reply to you, please just send me another one. I will make sure I do get back to you. But I love these conversations. I love being able to help people. Whether you're a coach, whether you're an affiliate owner, or you're someone who gets programs written for you, if you have questions, please reach out. I think I'll wrap it up there. This has been very enjoyable. John, the cameraman, told me that I should imagine that I'm speaking to an imaginary audience because he's obviously got a camera on me the whole time, and I've just realized that I've actually stared into space in exactly one position for the last 45 minutes. So sorry, John, if this makes some not very entertaining footage. But everyone, thank you very much for tuning in and have yourself a wonderful day.